Welcome back to another deep dive on green dolphin science.
Great to be back.
Today we're plunging into a topic that's, well, it's literally all around us, but often invisible. We're talking about tiny plastic particles floating in the air we breathe.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to unpack some pretty recent scientific research that really shines a light on this hidden problem. Specifically, we're looking at a study done in Shenyang, China.
Right, and the source for this is a research paper. It's titled Nanoplastics in the Shenyang City Atmosphere Distribution and Sources.
Sounds specific.
It is. And our mission, really, is to pull out the key findings, understand what these tiny plastic bits are doing in the air, where they're actually coming from.
And why we should care.
And crucially, why this research should matter to you listening.
Okay, let's dive in. So first things first, when we talk about microplastics and nanoplastics in the air, what are we actually talking about, size-wise?
Good question. So microplastics, generally, that's anything smaller than 5 millimeters. But nanoplastics, they're even tinier. We're talking less than 1 micrometer.
Okay, really small.
Really small. And this study, it really zooms in on the stuff found within what's called PM2.5.
PM2.5. We hear a lot about that in air quality reports.
Exactly. That's particulate matter with a diameter of 2.5 micrometers or less. So super fine particles.
And how do these tiny plastic fragments end up, floating around in the atmosphere?
Well, they mainly get there from larger plastic things breaking down.
Right, like wear and tear.
Pretty much. Think about friction, sunlight, UV rays, weathering, chemical reactions, even microbes chewing away at it.
Huh.
All these processes just break plastic down into smaller and smaller pieces. Eventually, they get so light the wind can just pick them up.
And here's where it gets, well, kind of concerning for us, right? These particles, especially the really tiny ones in PM2.5, they're small enough to get past our body's defenses.
That's the worry. They can be inhaled really deep into our respiratory system.
Deep into the lungs.
And the paper even mentions the potential for them to actually enter the bloodstream. That's the critical concern, really. The potential health effects mentioned in the research include a possibly heightened risk of respiratory issues and even cardiovascular diseases from inhaling them.
Okay. Now, I know microplastics in the air isn't totally new, right? There have been studies in places like Paris, London.
Shanghai, Beijing, yes, several big cities.
But this paper says that looking specifically at these micro and nanoplastics within the PM2.5 fraction, that's been more limited, especially in Shenyang.
Exactly right. That's the gap this study really fills. It gives us a much clearer picture of this potentially more hazardous size fraction of airborne plastic pollution, specifically in that region.
So how do they go about studying it? What was the method in Shenyang?
Okay, so the researchers had a couple of clear goals.
Right.
First, identify and measure these micro nanoplastics within the PM2.5 there.
Find out what's there and how much.
Yep. And second, analyze how it's distributed across the city and try to pinpoint the sources. Where is it coming from?
And where did they actually collect the air samples?
They were pretty strategic. They picked 7 different spots across Shenyang to get a good cross-section.
Like different types of areas?
Yeah, exactly. Commercial zones, residential neighborhoods, industrial areas, and also a suburban location for comparison.
And they sampled for a while?
They did. Continuous sampling, 24 hours a day over 2 weeks. And importantly, they did this during both the colder heating season and the non-heating season.
To see if winter heating made a difference.
Right, to check for those seasonal variations.
Okay, these things are incredibly tiny. How on earth do you find them and figure out what kind of plastic they are?
Yeah, that requires some pretty sophisticated techniques. The key method they relied on is called pyrolysis gas chromatography mass spectrometry.
GCMS. Okay, break that down.
So basically, think of it like this. You take your tiny air pollution sample, you heat it up really, really intensely,
Okay.
which breaks down any plastics in the sample into specific gases. Then the machine analyzes those gases. Different plastics produce unique chemical fingerprints when they break down.
So it can tell PE from PVC, for example.
Precisely. Polyethylene, polyvinyl chloride, polyamide. It identifies which specific polymers are present based on those fingerprints. And not just which, but also how much. It quantifies the mass concentration.
So it gives you the what and how much. That's powerful.
It really is. It's a key method for this kind of detailed analysis.
Okay, so they know what's there.
Yeah.
Then how did they tackle the where did it come from question?
For that part, they used a statistical tool. It's called the Positive Matrix Factorization Model, or PMF.
PMF.
Yeah. Think of it like a statistical detective. It looks at all the data, the different types and amounts of plastic found at all the different locations and times, and it tries to figure out which combinations of potential source profile.
Like factory emissions or something?
Exactly. Like industrial emissions, maybe agricultural dust, maybe fibers from textiles. It figures out which mix of those source profiles best explains the actual plastic cocktail they found in the samples.
Got it. Statistical detective work. All right, I'm on the edge of my seat. After all that sampling, that high-tech analysis, what did they find? What's the headline?
The biggest headline, I think, is that micro-nanoplastics were found in every single atmospheric PM2.5 sample they took in Shenyang.
Every single one. Wow.
Ubiquitous. Everywhere they look, these plastic particles were present in the fine particulate matter.
That really tells you something about how widespread this is. Okay, how much were they finding? Was it a lot?
Well, the concentrations varied. The highest single reading they got was 28.92 micrograms per cubic meter of air.
Okay.
The average across all samples came out to 7.62 micrograms per cubic meter. But here's the number that really jumped out at me.
Yeah. On
average, these micro and nanoplastics made up 12.33% of the total mass of the PM2.5.
Wait, hang on. Let me process that. Over 12% of the really fine, harmful particulate matter in the air was plastic.
That's what they found. A very significant chunk of the overall PM2.5 pollution.
That's staggering, actually. What kinds of plastic made up that 12%? Was it mostly one type?
It was dominated by two main types. Polyethylene, or PE, that was the biggest chunk at 43% of the total plastic mass.
Okay, PE, like in plastic bags and bottles.
Exactly. And the second biggest was polyvinyl chloride, PVC. That was 36%.
PVC, like in pipes and window frames?
Yep. And also things like packaging, flooring. They also quantified polyamide, PA, think nylon, that was 15%, and polypropylene, PP, at 6%. But yeah, PE and PVC were the big players.
Did it matter where they took the samples? Did concentrations change across the city?
Oh, definitely. Clear spatial differences. They found the highest average concentrations in the residential areas.
Residential. Not industrial. That surprises me a bit.
Yeah, residential averaged about 9.4 micrograms per cubic meter. Industrial was next, then commercial zones. The lowest levels were found in the suburban area. Overall, the urban areas average about 1.4 times higher concentrations than the suburban site.
Why do you think residential was highest? Any ideas from the paper?
Well, the researchers suggest it could be linked to just the sheer intensity of plastic use and disposal in daily life within those zones.
Like packaging, household goods.
Right. Packaging, products, but also textiles. And maybe activities like drying clothes outside, which can release fibers.
Interesting. And did the types of plastic change depending on the location?
Yes, that varied too. PE, for instance, was way higher proportionally in residential areas. Over 60% of the plastic mass there was PE.
Okay.
But CC was most dominant in the industrial areas, also making up over 60% in those locations.
Makes sense for PVC.
And PA, the polyamidalenone, was also noticeably higher in residential areas compared to the others.
You mentioned they sampled in different seasons, heating and non-heating. Did that make a difference?
They did see higher overall PM2.5 levels and higher micro-nanoplastic levels during the heating season. That's pretty typical for air pollution in northern China in winter.
Right. More coal burning maybe, less dispersion.
Things like that. But here's a nuance. When they dug into the statistics, the increase in plastics wasn't strictly because it was the heating season itself. It was more strongly linked to just how bad the overall air pollution was during those times.
So worse air pollution generally meant more plastic particles, regardless of the specific season.
It seemed to be more about the overall pollution severity, yeah. Which raises a question about that connection.
Exactly. Did the study look directly at the link between general PM2.5 levels and these plastic particles?
They did. And they found a pretty strong positive correlation. Statistically significant. Meaning when the overall PM2.5 concentration went up, the mass concentration of micro nanoplastics generally went up too. The correlation coefficient was 0.584, which suggests a solid link.
So the plastic particles are kind of riding along with the general smog.
That's a good way to put it. It strongly suggests that PM2.5 acts as a major carrier, a transmission medium for these micro and nanoplastics when you breathe in that fine particle pollution.
You're breathing in the plastic too?
Very likely, yes.
What about weather? Could rain or wind affect things?
Absolutely. Meteorology definitely played a part. Rain was good news, basically.
Washed it out.
Yep. The lowest concentrations were seen when it rained. Rain helps transport pollutants down to the ground or into water.
And no rain.
While poor air quality conditions with no rain could lead to settled particles getting kicked back up into the air suspension.
Right, and wind.
Stronger winds tended to disperse the pollutants, leading to lower concentrations locally. Pretty standard stuff for air pollution dynamics.
Okay, now let's get to that finding you mentioned earlier that sounded a bit counterintuitive. The idea that the percentage of plastic within the PM 2.5 was higher when the air was cleaner.
Yes, that was fascinating. So, while the total amount of pollution, both PM 2.5 and plastics, was lower during periods of better air quality, the proportion of that pollution that was made up of micro-nanoplastics was actually higher.
How much higher?
Well, remember, the overall average was about 12.3% plastic. In the cleaner suburban area, for example, micro-nanoplastics accounted for over 23% of the PM 2.5 mass.
Whoa. So cleaner air, proportionally more plastic. How does that work?
The explanation they offer makes sense when you think about particle physics. During clearer periods, often with stronger winds,
Things get blown away.
right. But heavier particles like bits of sand, dust, soil, they settle out of the air much faster. They're just heavier.
Okay.
These tiny micro and nanoplastics, though, are incredibly light. They have a much harder time settling. They tend to stay suspended in the air for longer.
So as the heavy stuff drops out quickly when conditions improve.
The lighter plastic particles hang around, meaning they make up a bigger percentage of the smaller amount of PM 2.5 that's left floating around.
That's really interesting and maybe a bit unsettling. It suggests the plastic component might be more persistent in the air, even when other pollutants decrease.
It certainly points that way.
Okay, let's pivot to the sources. The statistical detective work, the PMF model. Where did it point the finger for these airborne plastics in Shenyang?
The model came up with three main source categories contributing significantly. They labeled them industrial, agricultural, and domestic.
Industrial, agricultural, domestic.
Okay. And how did the contributions break down? Which was biggest?
Perhaps surprisingly, the largest estimated contribution came from agricultural sources.
Really? More than industrial?
Yep. Agricultural was estimated at 44.42% of the total micro-nanoplastics. Industrial was second at 36%, and domestic sources came in at 19.58%.
Wow. Agricultural at nearly 45%. Let's unpack those. What characterized the industrial source? What plastics were involved?
The industrial factor was heavily linked to PVC. Over half, 52.7% of its contribution was PVC.
Makes sense. Lots of PVC in industrial applications.
Exactly. Packaging, construction materials like pipes, wiring, automotive parts. The study points to emissions from manufacturing itself, but also from processing, waste management, and incineration, especially high in those industrial zones. Okay. Now, the biggest one. Agricultural. What's driving that? What plastics?
This factor showed strong links to PE, polyethylene, over 44%, and also PP, polypropylene, at 24%.
PE and PP from farming. How?
The paper points directly to the massive use of plastic films in agriculture. Think greenhouse coverings, plastic mulch laid on fields.
Right.
It's often PE.
Okay, those big sheets of plastic.
Exactly. And also PP and PVC are used in things like greenhouse fittings and irrigation pipes. China uses a huge amount of agricultural film, and the recycling rates aren't always high.
So this plastic sheeting just breaks down in the fields over time.
Fragments, gets brittle.
And the tiny pieces get blown into the air.
That appears to be the major pathway identified by the model for this source.
Okay, and the third source, domestic, contributing almost 20%. What did that involve?
This one was interesting. The domestic factor had its highest contribution from PA, polyamide nylon, and similar materials. Over 59% of this factor was PA.
Nylon, like from pit.
That's the primary link they make, yes. Textiles, clothing, but also home furnishings like carpets, upholstery fabrics. They cite other research showing PA fibers are common in the air, indoors and out, shed from textiles.
So just wearing clothes, washing them, having carpets contributes.
It appears to be a significant contributor, according to this analysis. This factor also included contributions from PP and PVC, likely from everyday household plastics, packaging, containers, toys, furniture bits, that sort of thing.
So industrial processes, farming plastics breaking down, and literally fibers from our clothes and plastics from our homes.
It's a complex mix coming from many aspects of modern life.
Okay, let's pull this together. The so what moment for the listener. Why does this specific study in Shenyang matter to someone listening, perhaps thousands of miles away?
Well, first, it's stark confirmation that these micro and nanoplastics aren't just theoretical, they are pervasive. They were found in every single air sample in a major city. It shows these are real environmental pollutants in the air we breathe.
And crucially, they're in the PM2.5 fraction. They're part of that really fine dust that we already know is harmful to health.
Exactly. Their presence in PM2.5 directly links this plastic pollution to potential respiratory and cardiovascular health risks upon inhalation. It's not just an environmental issue, it's a potential public health issue.
And the sources. It's not just big factories far away, right?
That's a key takeaway. Yes, industrial emissions contribute. Yes, agricultural practices contribute significantly. But also, domestic activities, things related to our clothes, our homes, our consumer goods, are also adding to this airborne plastic load.
It really broadens the scope of the problem, connects it much more directly to our daily lives.
It does. It shows how interconnected these things are.
And the study itself, using these specific methods like PyGCMS, is important for the science, right?
Absolutely. It's one of the first to provide these quantitative mass concentrations for micronanoplastics in PM2.5 in Shenyang. This kind of detailed, quantified data is vital for building a global picture, for comparing cities, and for tracking changes over time.
Adds a crucial piece to the puzzle.
And it offers standardized methods that other researchers can potentially use, which helps in building that comparable global data set. It confirms micronanoplastics are emerging pollutants we need to monitor carefully.
Okay, so summing up this deep dive, the Shenyang study paints a clear picture. Tiny plastic particles are a surprisingly significant slice of the fine air pollution pie there.
A slice averaging over 12%.
They travel tangled up with the general PM2.5 smog, and they come from a real mix of sources, industry, large-scale agriculture, and maybe unexpectedly for some, from domestic life, especially textiles.
Yeah, a complex picture with diverse origins.
So here's the final thought to leave you with. We now know that activities as common as wearing and washing our clothes, using plastic packaging, farming our food, they all contribute significantly to these tiny plastic particles becoming airborne. Particles that make up a substantial percentage of the fine air pollution we inhale. What does that finding really mean for how we think about air quality, about the environment, and maybe even about our everyday choices?
It definitely adds a new layer to the air pollution challenge, doesn't it? Suggests we need to consider materials and waste in a whole new light, not just for landfill or ocean impact, but for air quality too. Our consumption patterns are literally in the air.
A lot to mull over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Always fascinating. Thanks for having me.